big business casts its shadow over all of society, and you can't really have democracy as long as that's the case. Well, that's a limitation that goes deep.
There's been a revolution in payments.
Democracy, poverty reduction, and cryptocurrency.
Communities get their own currency.
Decentralized social networks.
History is repeating itself. And I just thought, since we have about 15 minutes, I wanted to talk about the present and kind of break new ground maybe with this conversation a little bit. So the first thing I wanted to kind of talk about is how capitalism affected the journalism industry. And like I said, I think they needed to adapt to create a product. If the users are the product that they're selling to the advertisers, let's say, then they need to get a lot of users, or as they say, engagement and clicks and visits. And so not even the New York Times is immune to this. They change their titles, in real time based on how well they're received. And so one thing is, what if you asked what could be both sides? So one thing, I wanted to share my screen and kind of show you what both sides could look like. And I'm thinking about the difference between competition, a competitive system like we have today based on profit and Wall Street earnings. And on the other hand, collaboration, things that they do in science, for example, with peer review and so forth, things that they do with the open source movement, code commits, and the things that they do in Wikipedia, where they essentially have a talk page and they duke it out before the public gets to see the final result. So what I wanted to the first question I have for you is, what if we had a nonprofit news media that was more like Wikipedia, where each person has one of these? They have a phone. These days, you don't need to send intrepid journalists into war zones necessarily, because people are already in them. And if we don't know, for example, whether, to take an example, Assad gassed his own people, or whether it was the rebels or what happened, we may not know. Why do we leave it up to the for-profit journalism and media to decide what the story, how to digest a story for us, when we can have a motley assortment of people with many different views on a topic converge on something like a Wikipedia talk page, and the end result would reflect all the criticisms, serious criticisms that were brought up. It might be a slightly slower process. It might take a day to come out, but I would argue it would be healthier for society, and people wouldn't be as divided into echo chambers, because they would see multiple sides of every argument. That's what I mean by both sides, essentially.
I don't agree with that notion of both sides. I mean, there are many sides. You look at the mainstream media, both sides mean centrist to far right. There's other things that don't make it. We could go into it. The Wikipedia model, whatever you think about it, there's some good things in Wikipedia. If you want to learn about quantum physics, medieval history, classical Greece, good articles. You want to look about current things, very different. A lot of problems with it. Groups that organize to try to get their own views massively through, they tend to dominate, and others don't. There's plenty of problems, but it's not a news medium. It doesn't have bureaus all over the world reporting. It doesn't have editors who it doesn't have the whole structure that enables media to function. It doesn't have advertisers. That means it's not going to be able to compete in the marketplace. Now, when you say that advertisers want to reach a broad public, it's only partially true. So suppose that say ExxonMobil realizes that they can reach a broad public as they can by saying, okay, we're going to close down our fossil fuel production, and we're going to we want to support moves to renewable energy. Suppose an article comes out like that. Is ExxonMobil going to support it? They've got a large audience that way, but that's not the message they want. We might remember an observation of George Orwell's, brief observation, but he did discuss the question of media in free societies, his introduction to Animal Farm, which most people don't read because it was suppressed, but
Okay.
many years later. It's addressed to the people of England. He says, this is a satire on the totalitarian enemy, but don't feel too self-righteous about it, because in free England, unpopular ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And one of the mechanisms he discusses is the media. Brief comment, he says the media are owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not seeing certain ideas at present.
Well, that's what I am talking about. I'm saying that a media that is owned top down as a pyramid by, let's say, News Corp, Rupert Murdoch's company.
Who's funding it?
So I actually wanted to show you my screen. I wanted to show you an example where so-called free speech under capitalism, it looks like this. There's news anchors, local stations, that essentially say the same talking points word for word because they were bought by Sinclair Television. And of course, you know, we tend to associate free capitalism or free enterprise with free speech. But if you are hired or fired based on what you say, and essentially it looks like this.
As 4 News produces.
But
We are concerned about our country. We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
but
We are concerned about
Word for word, they are saying the same thing. And there are dozens of stations, local stations, you could say propaganda in some way, because the message is being, they're just mouthpieces, the people saying what they are. So my contention is that this will not produce necessarily the free speech or the robust discourse that society needs in order to evaluate different issues, essentially. What do you say to that?
Take a look at talk radio. If you go back to the 60s, there was talk radio, not anything like the scale today, but it was actually pretty broad. It had a range of, nothing like today, it had a range of what they call them, talk masters, liberal, conservative, libertarian, left, others. By now it's all changed radically to what you just described. It's all extreme far right. The stations were bought up, bribed, other things. I could give you particular examples from my own experience of where independent radio stations were blocked by pressures from advertisers and management just not to discuss certain things. If they did it, they'd go out of business.
Right.
Some of the pressures are subtle. It's just not the kind of thing you say. Okay, it's not an advertiser comes in and hits you over the head with a mallet. It's just understandings. It's just not the nice kind of thing to talk about and so on. In fact, going on with Orwell, who's well aware of this, is that one of the ways in which you get indoctrination and control is just by being immersed in the dominant culture. You go to the best schools and so on, have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things you just wouldn't do to say. Okay, so you don't, if there's a Gallup poll, an international Gallup poll, on which happens to ask the question, which country is the greatest threat to world peace? And it turns out overwhelmingly the United States. Nobody else is even visible. You just know that's not the kind of thing you report. Nobody has to tell you. So
that's exactly why I feel that the content of the news is modeled after the system that produces it. Here, I want to show you sort of Wiki News. Okay, this is an example of a site where the news is edited collaboratively by people. And you can see almost on the, even on the front page, the selection of news is very different, perhaps, than what you would expect in a for-profit newspaper. A lot of the things that you might read about in Africa, you might not even know about. Here, for example, 23rd Italian ambassador to Congo. Now, what I'm saying is, here's a collaboration tab, which is essentially similar to the talk page on any Wikipedia site. And what happens is people have different complaints, different issues with the article. Is this done? Is this sourced properly? And so on. And I'm saying that I think having the collaborative tab in the open like this will enable this sort of rough draft to be prepared so that when the final article comes out, the people aren't necessarily fed only one side. And I want to compare that to something like Twitter, okay, something like Facebook, because it's not just about the companies that produce the news articles, the journalists, if you will, or these days it's also the independent voices. You know, yourself, you've been active for decades, but now there's people on the left, on the right, everywhere with their own channels on YouTube, million subscribers. People like David Pakman and Kyle Kalinske, David Dole are on the left as well. Now they have a robust sort of bread to YouTube, some of which are openly socialist and even criticize the establishment, just capitalism itself. Here, I wanted to just make a stark comparison. On the one hand, you have a collaborative platform where no one has any profit motive and doesn't necessarily gain anything, but also doesn't spend a lot of effort going to a country and writing an article and editing and so forth. Everyone does a small contribution. On the other hand, you have things like this in Twitter, where if you go and look at the trending things and you know, Godzilla versus King Kong advertisement, and then you've got Trump, let's say, to 50,000 people. Well, he's a president, but you also have other people who are not politicians able to send an unfiltered tweet at 3 a.m. to 5 million people. And so my question is, when it comes to free speech, certainly people should have freedom of speech. But I feel like these privately owned platforms that were built by Mark Zuckerberg and others are still being privately owned and managed today. And people expect too much of them. And one quick thing I just wanted to show you and then ask you the question is that we had two things happen just recently. We had a Senate hearing literally 2 days ago on their concern about a free and diverse press. I just want to play 30 seconds of that for you. This is bipartisan.
Valuable content to the detriment of broader society, which, quote, can lead to wider social, political, and cultural harm through the decline of authoritative and reliable news media, the resultant spread of fake news, and the decline of the local press, which is often a significant force in sustaining communities, end quote. With that in mind, today's hearing is an opportunity to examine solutions to this urgent problem. Earlier this week, I reintroduced the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act with Ranking Member Buck.
This act that he refers to is introduced by Senators Klobuchar and John Kennedy, and also representative in the House of Representatives. The thing is, they're trying to use more competition and more capitalism to solve the problem, but they recognize that a problem exists. My question to you is, what if there was a site where essentially, like this one, for example, that like Wiki News, that could actually make a collaborative discourse, and then people would be exposed to the result the same way that scientific journals do peer review before they push the science on everybody else, because people don't have the tools to fact check everything. What if there was no profit motive, and what if it was run like scientific journals? If we ran the news that way, what do you think of that, essentially?
Certainly in favor of diversifying sources. We actually have something like that. It just isn't one source, it's a variety. So you can turn to Democracy Now! And hear a lot of things you'll never find in the mainstream media. You can look at Truth Out, Common Dreams, other sites, again, lots of things that aren't there. What you're suggesting, if I understand, is let's make this more collaborative. That's fine, but you still are not going to be able to overcome the fact that there is a radical maldistribution of power. All of this news comes from somewhere. It's coming from the major centers that gather news, like the New York Times, for example. That's, they and a few others are where the information is coming from which all this is selected. Now, in the internet era, you can pick up foreign news, but this is a chore. And it's going to turn out that most of the population, which doesn't have endless time available, will go to the immediately available sources. And they're going to be skewed towards where power lies. Now, there's no way to deal with this within the information system. It's a problem of the society. As long as you have radical maldistribution of power, you're going to have overwhelming control by centralized power on the political system. Doesn't matter what laws you pass. You're going to have overwhelming power over the major media. These are things that have to be dealt with at a deeper level than finding methods like these, which are good ones. I think it's a good idea, but these are always going to be subordinated to the enormous concentration of power within the economic system, which affects everything. Can't be stopped by laws or by devices. You can modify it, you can mitigate it, you can offer better means for people like this. That's all to the good. But we should recognize the limitations as long as we're living in a, not really capitalist, but a state capitalist system with high concentration of power in private hands. That casts an overwhelming effect over the whole society. John Dewey put it pretty well when he said that big business casts its shadow over all of society, and you can't really have democracy as long as that's the case. Well, that's a limitation that goes deep.
Well, Noam, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I mean, I would love at some point, let's do this again about decentralization of power, because I have a lot to say about it. I just want to say I don't just interview people. I've interviewed Thomas Greco, community currency economist, also for decades. He's been studying and saying much of the same things as you. It would be great to get both of you guys on. But I just want to say, over the last 10 years, I've been actually building solutions and trying to build these solutions myself, as you know, to some extent. So I'd love to have maybe a longer conversation sometime. And I would love to ask you what you think of the stuff that may work.
These are very interesting ideas, but we have to recognize the constraints that exist by the deeply undemocratic nature of the society, which is very hard to get around within a private enterprise system. You can limit it, you can mitigate it, but like Dewey said, it's always going to cast the shadow over everything. Well, hope we can go on someday. Sorry, it's tight.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I'll send you this video. Talk to you later.
Talk to you.
Join the intercoincommunity.org. Literally just go to community.intercoin.org, right?
Yeah.
And sign up. And then what I'd like you to do is, if you have any questions, don't be shy. Start a new topic, right? And just, even if you don't have any questions, just introduce yourself. We have a thing here, like it's going to show up, like introduce yourself. And we're going to reach out to you. Because what I want is not just for people to invest in Intercoin. I want people to understand Intercoin and to get involved and join the movement, right? And we can only do that if we are all kind of communicating and we're all building it together. So thank you very much, everybody. You know, you could either drop your email in the chat if you haven't already, or just sign up on the site and we will circle back.